here we go. I'm gonna try and get all this done as a producer. Michael Johns is my guest. We're gonna talk everything politics. It's the Jim Fannon Show. Welcome aboard. Hello, my friend. It's been a while since we talked, and last time we spoke, I asked you to make a bold prediction, and then you made the prediction, and it all came true. You said, rightly, that, and you made this prediction before the certification of the vote, in between the election and the certification, that the Supreme Court would have would lack the strength to do anything about what happened in the election. And so I guess we'll just lead straight into that. Do you feel like you've fixed your problems, or are the Republicans destined to never be elected again in the United States?
Absolutely haven't fixed the problems. The origin of this, in my judgment, still continues to go back to November 3. And you can see it in the sentiment of the American people, in the sense that Trump and Obama, they both had their very difficult periods and serious opposition, but they also had bases of support, kind of a buffer of 40% or so, and rarely went underneath that. This President Biden has no such safety net. And, in the judgment of a lot of people, that's simply because, he did not receive the most votes in the history of the American presidency, as is contended. Now, the judgment that I put forward, and I think it's a sensible one, is you have 6 of these states at least that have asked to be reassessing them, and just about every systematic barrier that could be erected to that has been erected. As for the Supreme Court, my view on that was simply that even in a different set of circumstances, they did probably lack the leadership and fortitude, but they also are not commonly in the business of hearing cases where the evidence is in question. Right. So when you think about your typical Supreme Court case, it's usually all the facts are stipulated and it goes to the court, and the court is interpreting whether a certain law or judgment or position or policy is or is not constitutional. That's really ultimately the role of the Supreme Court. And in my view, we have underlying questions here as they relate to facts. Now, I think this is the most important, as the final point on the election, is that you had, on our side, the Navarro reports, 3 editions of them that are overwhelmingly compelling. You had you did have the filing with the Supreme Court by the Texas AG that was signed on to by multiple other state attorneys general. And then we had thousands of affidavits signed under penalty of law by individuals. And these weren't partisan Republicans in all cases. They were a lot of times just election officials, careerists, or even Democrats. What do we have on the other side? That's kind of what I would sort of push back on and say that if the Navarro reports, for instance, were systematically inaccurate or flawed or embellished or overtly partisan, you would see Navarro reports the rebuttal. And that would be the end of the debate. There is no such document because there's substantive and serious allegations in there that cannot be rebutted because they actually did happen.
Do you think this happens with Stone and Bannon if they're on the job? We see them openly, I say them, the left, coming out and openly gloating in the New York Times about how they took these states down and made these unconstitutional changes to the election laws. And do you think that if you had the political pit bulls in the war room that, they put a stop to this years before? Because, by election time it's too late, obviously. But do you think if you had the pit bulls in the war room that this actually goes down?
I think that's a very good point, because I just simply think you cannot underestimate the importance of personnel. And in government, you can have the best president of the United States with the best vision, and he himself or herself may have immense fortitude and strength and boldness, but the operational components, both of electoral politics and of policy politics, are so complex and have so many different components that really any person along the way can sort of impede or slow walk those initiatives. And so, for instance, what was the biggest real position of Trump in the 2016 campaign was to build the wall. Well, then personnel really got, let's be honest, neglected. You ended up having Anonymous sitting there as chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security, kind of the right-hand operational person in that very crucially important department. And not so surprisingly, not a lot of progress was made in that first 2 years where there was, control of the House and Senate and votes, I believe, aligned to have gotten that done. Had the decision really been made. So, and those, I could go on and on with those examples. I mean, there was no department, including the West Wing of the White House itself, that wasn't filled with opponents of Trump. I mean, you've got the media against you, and you've got academia against you, and you've got Congress sort of scratching their head about what direction you're taking things, and an entire far left activist community. You need at least your own personnel in your own administration to be sufficiently loyal. And for all of the immense good things that Trump did, and I think can potentially do should he run again, the one deficiency we can't be blind to is the fact that the appointments were handed off through Reince Priebus to individuals who didn't really share that vision. And the result was a staff, an administration staff that wasn't really terribly distinct or different from what you would have seen had Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio actually secured that nomination. And that's frustrating. And it's also something that we haven't really talked a lot about, because the sad reality of politics is, you kind of get in these areas of loyalty and you don't want to be critical of your own side. And I guess, I'm not being critical because I don't think these were Trump decisions. I think this was Trump placing trust in people that he trusted, had his best interests in the MAGA agenda at heart. And sadly, those individuals really didn't. Bannon is a great mind, in my view. I've come to think even higher of him in the present tense than I did during the administration. Not someone who has really the longevity that I've had in this, so I never even really heard of him before 2015. But when I look at some of the messaging he's putting out now, I think that's pretty inspirational, setting aside the ethical issues he had, which are inexcusable, sadly. But we're all human, I guess.
Yeah, sure. How much hope do you have moving forward that we see some semblance of fairness in the next presidential elections? Maybe you can touch even on 2022. No,
I really don't see it. I think, firstly, to have confidence in 2022, you have to have confidence in 2020. There's no such thing as a pass.
Right.
And it shouldn't be permissible in any election, much less. This is not a city commission race. This was a presidency of the United States. And you could see it in the numbers of the American people too, where they just don't buy into the fact that this guy could not attract an audience, even in a high school gymnasium, lost to a guy who was drawing stadium-sized crowds and had extraordinary enthusiasm. And then just on a kind of anecdotal basis, they're talking to their friends and their neighbors. And you've got people that were really enthusiastically supportive of Trump, people who maybe not have liked a few components of his demeanor or personality, but voted for him. You don't see anyone out there who says, yeah, Joe Biden, this 50-year career is so exceptional. I mean, it's a really an entirely unremarkable career of almost zero accomplishment, except for what he's been able to obtain for his family in these ongoing pay-to-play schemes that he's developed. It's almost a systematic pattern throughout his career where he's put in charge of some functional area, usually in foreign affairs. He goes out, he fails at that initiative, but his family somehow ends up with some, sweet deal. And that was something that a lot of us were raising. It's very germane now that we're dealing with issues with China's Communist Party, with Putin on the move in Ukraine, and with other conflicts, I think, as it relates to these irrational decisions like Afghanistan. It's wrong, by the way. I mean, and I almost have to hesitate myself because you want to call it mismanagement or incompetence, because that's almost giving him the benefit of the doubt that he, in fact, and his team are acting in the best interest of the United States of America. Mm-hmm. I have to concede, when I really, really deeply ponder it, I know that this Biden administration and the personnel that are in there, from Blinken and guys like this, they're operationally sound. I mean, they're solid and they're intelligent people. The problem is they have an entirely dramatically different vision of the role of the United States in the world. And ultimately, when you really push them on it, they're a believer in what this managed decline philosophy and this idea that too much power is held by the United States and that we need a balancing of that. That's what we call this globalist vision. It's manifested predominantly out of the World Economic Forum and Davos and the 1% of the world. It's got very specific points to it, and it's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, it's like literally a document that's out there, and it's been guiding policy for a long, long time. It's one of the reasons we've allowed China's Communist Party to get away with these extraordinarily, unacceptable levels of intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices and currency manipulations and whatnot. It's also a reason why we've had to shoulder the burden of all of these conflicts abroad, multi-decade conflicts where, we had interests, but so did the rest of the world. It's why we're wrestling with NATO to get even a 2% GDP commitment for the common defense. So the world's on fire tonight. There's no doubt about it. I think you kind of opened
nothing to laugh about
we were
either.
on air. I think it was before we went on air. But yeah, I mean, the world's on fire, and the world's on fire because on the most basic of levels, and I think you can go multiple tiers beneath this, but the whole world watched Afghanistan. And it was just simply from the retreat at Bagram Air Base in early July, with literally the Afghans on that base waking up the next morning and saying, where are the Americans that were gone? They're like literally left overnight, no pre-announcement, no handoff ceremony, high security prison on that base that was housing over 1,000 enormously dangerous terrorists, just left unguarded. The message was sort of sent that we were just handing this to the Taliban. And you think Putin saw that, Xi Jinping saw it,
weakness.
Pakistan saw it,
Mm-hmm.
powers of the world saw it,
Mm-hmm.
and our friends like Taiwan and NATO and Saudi Arabia, UAE, all these countries that we gained enormous improved relationships with under Trump, and had a sort of anxiety or having anxiety attacks tonight because the message that was sent with the August 15 fall of Kabul is, look, you cannot rely on the United States of America. And in foreign affairs and national security, that is simply the most dangerous message you can send. You can downgrade expectations. You can say, hey, look, we can't do this or that, but you have to be you have to be a country of your word. And now how many times have we not been, just in this last year, a country of our word?
It sounds like you've been wrestling with the same type of question I have been, where I've kind of, I don't want to give the World Economic Forum or any of their students or Schwab or Biden or anyone on the left as much credit other than to say they're just incompetent. but because I don't think they're all that bright, so I can't see them laying the foundation and the infrastructure for a takeover of the Great Reset. And even just saying it, I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's right there. They're out in the open bragging about taking over parliaments, especially in Canada. And now, and I mean, this is great talking to you because I think you put it so succinctly, is the difference in ideology, how it plays out in real life. Like when you put these ideas into politics, if you have weak borders, you have some serious issues in your country. If you don't have fair elections, or if you don't abide by the Constitution for your elections. And I was kind of as an outsider, and I never paid attention. I told you this before. I've never paid attention to American politics before Trump. And it wasn't because I was a Trump fan. I just decided I wasn't going to generate any more new hate for the man. And then, he started to get my funny bone. He's hilarious. And then, every time he came down on an issue, I'm like, and I'm a recently red-pilled guy too. I'm a 10-time Green Party candidate. I was about as left as you can get. But when the left went mad, I had to find a home. And it ended up being in the moderate middle. So I'm like slightly right-leaning now. But, the political ideology, when they come out and say things like whatever it is, supporting Black Lives Matter and then putting the truckers in jail. And then when it's laid out in political policy, we have drastic different countries now. And speak to me a little bit about the differences between the vast, horrible the changes that we've seen under Biden compared to Trump. You can start with the border, but there's many issues that we can hit on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really recognizable. Nothing that's common sense is getting done, and everything that's irrational is getting done. So, the case of Afghanistan, it was the longest war in American history, 20 years, from 3,000 lives, many of them in Arlington Cemetery, young people of promise who went off to fight post 9/11 and what they, at the time, properly believed was a higher cause and a righteous mission of rooting out terrorism, only to have that entire investment, trillions of dollars, and the human toll, handed off to these crazed terrorists. I mean, literally a government, one of whom is on the FBI most wanted list, in their, I think, Minister of Interior. Then you get into China's Communist Party. I mean, fingerprints all over the pandemic. No doubt that this was released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. No doubt that they lied to the world about it. No doubt that they lied to the World Health Organization about it. No doubt that they kept out the World Health Organization and kept out our own CDC at a time, in early January of 2020, when it would have been immensely helpful to containing the magnitude of that pandemic. Nothing there. They were completely uncooperative and facilitating really of the pandemic's march. I mean, never, and then destroying the samples. You go on and on with every single act that they took. It was designed to make this more, not less difficult on us. And that's assuming that it wasn't human made in the first place. I mean, that we describe this as a lab, like it's involved in, routine clinical research. It's a PLA, Chinese military bioweapons facility at the end of the day. And this is part of the problem with just the general relationship that we have with China, and maybe to a lesser extent with Russia, is that I think too many tend to look at these countries and think that they operate like ours do. Nothing happens in China that the CCP isn't in control of. So, clearly every aspect of that, including the disappearance of witnesses who were trying bravely to warn the world of the magnitude of this, weren't touched. And Then you get into the genocide of the Uyghurs. Genocide, right? How many times since World War II have we said never again, and said it with in the most solemn, serious, committed ways? Organizations have said it, countries have said it, people have said it. Well, never again has been going on for a few years now, and I'm not seeing the magnitude of passion or outrage rise to this moment of urgency as it relates to 2 to 3 million Uyghurs that are being held in concentration camps and work camps in Xinjiang province in China. So if that were the singular issue going on in the world right now, it would be a 10 out of 10 on urgency, because it's genocide, and there's no more serious word in geopolitics than genocide. And then sadly, of course, it's not the only crisis that we're confronting. I do feel, and this is speculative, that when you have a world power like Putin and Russia, invading Ukraine, it's going to get a lot of attention, a lot of scrutiny, and a lot of anxiety. I am, at the end of the day, continue to be vastly more concerned about China's Communist Party and the magnitude of infiltration it has into the United States, the amount of intel operations it has in the US. By the way, our own FBI director has said they've had to open counterintelligence investigations about one every 12 hours. That's the magnitude of infiltration into this country. Now, of course, for those who aren't politically engaged or politically involved, it's tough to kind of communicate, what that actually means, and how dangerous it actually is. But it's based on 3-4 decades now. I guess you go all the way back to, Nixon and Kissinger to China in a different world that we lived in back then. But that kind of started it all off.
Yeah.
So, and then, you mentioned the border. You can't, obviously just crucially important. I mean, we've had, 2 to 3 million illegals. Nobody knows who they are. Over 100 countries they've been represented. How with a straight face do we possibly say that we're serious about terrorism, serious about the drug war, serious about human trafficking, serious about crime, serious about American jobs and wages, when you're letting that go on? But if you go to the World Economic Forum, one of the key points is they, a big believer, they want to see south to north migration, Africa to Europe, Latin America to the US. And with your green background, you might, be able to put some context on that, but they do a lot of it's done in the auspices of climate, which in my view, that's the real crisis of the climate debate, is what could be some underlying really legitimate issues have been so utterly politicized and one-sided that they've lost all credibility. And then you run the risk of going almost to the opposite extreme of saying it's all nonsense. But you can't help but say in the political context, it has been all nonsense. I mean, look at this Paris Accord that would have, the world's largest polluter is China's Communist Party. You mentioned Steve Bannon. One thing Steve said is, he says, if you were going to do one singular thing to improve the global climate, and you could only do one thing, taking down the CCP would be like the most logical thing. I mean, when you look at the magnitude of emissions that they have, the continued commitment they have to their coal and traditional energy resources, and what they're doing in the South China Sea, just carving up these coral reefs to create military islands. They're far and away the greatest threat. And yet when you look at environmental activism, where is it all directed? It's all directed against the United States. Why is it directed against the United States and not China? Well, now you get into the global flow of money and the fact that a lot of these activist organizations have been funded by China. And why not? Is there not anything more sensible than to try to, impede your biggest economic competitor with regulatory restraints that don't apply to you? I mean, it's never been an even playing field with China from day one, and that's one of the reasons we've had this extraordinary trade deficit, loss of whole industries, jobs, hollowing out of the Rust Belt and our middle class and all the associated societal problems, including our drug problem, which in my view has a lot of its origins in the demise of traditional manufacturing in this country. There's something, and that gets into kind of a psychological area, but there's something about American manufacturers, who've in many cases followed in the footsteps of their parents, and guys who take their jobs really seriously and take great pride in it, and then all of a sudden they don't have it, they can't provide for their families, they're facing anxiety, tension, divorce, and then a lot of times they have on top of it physical ailments that literally have come from all this hard labor. And one thing flows to another, and the next thing they're a fentanyl overdose. 95% of which comes from where? China.
Right.
Through where? Predominantly the open border.
Yeah, it seems like so many of these arguments, if you let them play out, by the time you get down to it, like I saw Piers Morgan, I don't know, he had a feminist on the other day, and she was saying, oh no, we should let transgenders, compete with women. And now we've got a new class of feminism called the TERF, right? Because you're trans exclusionary, radical feminist if you don't think, if you don't want to have sex with a trans person, then you're accused of being transphobic. No, I just like my girls. Some of these arguments get so ridiculous. And Piers Morgan was talking to this girl, and she says, no, we should be able to compete. And he's like, okay, so just let me get this straight. You take the best male boxer in the world, and you give him estrogen for a year, and he should be able to go and compete with women. Have I got you right here? And it's almost like you can see the word, the words having an effect on these people, and they're like, oh shit, I'm backed into a corner now. But to me, all of this stuff, including the Russia thing and the border and all of it just seems like, and I appreciate your take on Russia, if you could chime in on that, is nothing more than a distraction from the real issues. 20 black men are killed every day, and we have as many, overdosing on opioids, and and it's the same people that voted for the mask mandates that are standing up in outrage over what's going on in Ukraine. I don't understand. Gavin Wax put it pretty clearly the other day. The NATO moves and all this kind of stuff and the historical background. Ukraine is like one of the most corrupt countries in the world. My country just gave them $500 million. We don't have enough problems at home with drugs and our children and stuff like this. We're just giving.
The only argument that you would make for military support for Ukraine, and I've supported that, and by the way, Trump did as well. I mean, we lost Crimea predominantly because Obama, sent them blankets and things like that, but never gave them the lethal force they needed to defend their country. But Trump changed that, and as a result, for 4 years, he didn't have any Russian aggression for the most part against Ukraine, and now they sense weakness. But if you were going to make the argument that, hey, we've got to go all chips in and defend the complete sovereignty of Ukraine, then you have to ask the other questions. Where were you in this whole Afghanistan debate? Because, in my view, we're talking about an underdeveloped Central Asian country that's been, at war for most of modern times. But, they did have a developed constitution, over 500 Afghan men and women that gathered and debated and came up with a constitution signed by the president. They had an elected assembly and president. And the provisions of that constitution were very clear about the fact that the first vice president was to assume the presidency in the absence of the president. So the president flees the country under threat, hasn't shown any intent on returning. There's no basis to acknowledge the Taliban as any legitimate governing entity, simply because they had more guns and more willingness to die for their cause than anyone else. I warned back in the late summer that was sending tyrants of the world a very dangerous message as it related to Xi Jinping and Taiwan, as it related to Russia and Ukraine. And by the way, Putin's had these troops on the Ukraine border for a long, pretty much, back into the spring of 21. So, it's been something I think that he saw right away as it relates to Biden. And then you have to say, like, well, what's motivating? To me, this is the biggest question. And I think I can answer almost any question about what's transpiring. But the one question that I can't answer is a question that no one's asking. And that is, Joe Biden and his family have enough money for 10 lifetimes. The work that they did, in my view, it deserves more scrutiny, and there might be criminal dimensions to it that deserve to be explored and should be explored by the FBI. But what motivation would he possibly have to harm and take down this country? I made the argument over the last few weeks that has to be more than just money. That wouldn't be enough. So when we talk about, you will hear this phrase used very routinely now among opponents, that Biden's compromised. Well, compromising him isn't enough. It's not enough to sort of say, well, yeah, his son had this, $100 million plus private equity fund that was almost exclusively funded by the Bank of China, or the wife of the mayor of Moscow, one of the closest friends that Putin has, had $3.5 million unexplained to this day, just, wire transferred to him, or that he sat on the board of Burisma, for extraordinary sums of money, despite having zero experience in energy, zero experience on Ukraine. Those may gain favor or an opportunity for communication and an audience that might not exist in a close policy call. Maybe they have influence there and you lean one way or the other. But this idea of destroying this country and its foundational principles in ways that it's very difficult to see us being able to turn around. And then the personal legacy that he's going to be leaving, which is going to be a devastatingly negative one, seemed to require something deeper than just money. And I wish we had a government, law enforcement, and Congress who are asking that logical question. Because
so are you hinting at some spiritual evil of some sorts? Because what else is there? Power and control and money. I mean, same kind of thing. Like, what else is there? Like, I mean,
when I've gotten into these issues, I've always noticed we lose the debate when we start speculating. I mean, obviously, I have in the back of my mind what I think are some probable scenarios that actually would put a person in the position of doing the seemingly irrational. So that's one thing. Like, for instance, if there had been, a kind of collaboration on voter issues, and that was known to the CCP or Russia or both, them coming forward with that would delegitimize Biden, and he couldn't do it. So if you're sitting there and the phone rings and it's Xi Jinping on the other line, say in early August, saying get your troops out of Bagram by or out of Bagram in July, you probably, or we're going to go public with this stuff.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
You might be inclined to get your troops out of Bagram and not pre-announce. You do it in the most irrational way, right? Because there's no way you can look. Even though these guys are ideologically very different, we have 20 years of experience in handing off military assets.
Yeah.
We don't leave $80 billion of equipment behind for the Taliban for any other reason than the fact that we wanted to. We don't leave Americans in harm's way. And that air base, by the way, is a few hundred miles away from China. It's a few hundred miles away from Iran. In this moment in the sort of evolution of geopolitics and strategic challenges, it's very difficult to envision an air base that would be more vitally important to the U.S. I think you could trade off a number of our air bases abroad, saying that they were less important. And certainly we could have negotiated scenarios under which we removed our troops but maintained our presence at that air base. That's not uncommon. It's what we've done for the most part all over the world.
I mean, maybe I'm feeling kind of hopeless.
You can't feel hopeless.
Well, I mean, and I try not to look at the news, but it's just we see so many issues, and to get to where Biden picked up, it took a lot of work. It was incremental steps, and it seems like we slid back so fast.
Oh yeah.
And recovering that ground again, it doesn't matter who comes in. No one's a savior. The presidential occupant has has limited powers, not very limited powers, but there's only so much he can do. The system kind of works against him, and rightly so. I mean, the forefathers kind of dreamed that up back in the early days. But sometimes I just look and I go, we are, like, you look at people coming across the border, you look at the big cities, violent crime, our inability to have reasonable discussions about the important issues. Nobody wants to talk about crime, because it immediately becomes a race issue. And then, we have to deal with the root causes. If you don't, then, Band-Aids, throwing money at it never works. Gun control doesn't work.
And the good news, like for our side at least, is we have statistics. It's not just hyperbole and theory.
With this mass formation psychosis, nobody...
I wish I had this right at the forefront, but you go back, it was... more police stops over a period of like 2 years than there are people in the country. It was over 300 million or something like that, of which there had been, less than 10 African-Americans, unarmed African-Americans shot by law enforcement. And even each one of those cases had, sort of factors that were contributing to them. And in almost every one of those cases, they were held accountable. This idea that we have American law enforcement out there, shooting Black people dead for no apparent reason except for the color of the skin is absurd.
No.
African Americans are very well represented in law enforcement. And the only thing I can say is that, because we've had certain communities in this country that have been either unpoliced or subjected to substantial amounts of crime. They've been comparatively over-policed. The number of stops may go up, things like that, but you're not seeing that reflected in the numbers. And the bigger issue, though, so when anyone says, "Hey, I feel hopeless," and this was kind of how everyone felt at the beginning of the Tea Party movement in 2009. You had Obama come in, media loved him, country, there was a lot of momentum beyond his presidency. A lot of undue, I think, an unjustified hope that he was somehow going to be different, which he wasn't. And then, the House in the hands of Nancy Pelosi, the Senate in the hands of then Harry Reid. People said, we're done. What are we going to do? And well, what we did was we took control of our side. And I want to say the biggest deficiency that we confront in this debate, operationally, strategically, ideologically, is spinelessness and lack of strategy and unity on our side. Money has corrupted our side of the movement, sadly.
Wow.
We have, what you would call in traditional Marxist terms, controlled opposition, right? So what were the first thing Lenin, kind of came up with this concept? What the first thing you do is you create your opposition before the opposition manifests sort of organically. That way you can collapse the opposition, you can control the verbiage of the opposition. So when you take these really big titanic issues, some of which we just talked about, like what happened on November 3, you heard my view. I don't know for sure that Biden is or isn't legitimate, but there's sure more than enough evidence to be going back and systematically looking through the allegations that are made. And then the genocide against the Uyghurs and CCP's culpability in the pandemic where's the leadership on these issues on our side? I understand that we don't control the government, but where are the people standing up, representing truth and, just reasonable thinking as it relates to confronting some of the biggest challenges of this country's history, really?
Yeah, it seems like if you're talking about the right, the political right, you really need to shift gears and change tactics, because what they've been doing isn't working. We still have these false narratives that run rampant. The media is still controlled by the left. We still have, the infiltration of these WEF groups. And you say, well, it can't just
stop. We're always, if you ever notice this, we're always
reacting.
Yeah, it's like, even people that you might consider leaders on our side, when you look at what do they actually do? They're basically narrating, doing the play-by-play announcements of our defeats. They're they're like the play-by-play announcers of the Bad News Bears. That's not leadership. I mean, it's probably useful that the American people are aware of some of these things that are occurring, because I think it can be inspiring, hopefully, but even that, there's downside danger to it. You can demoralize the American people too. So we have to be speaking to aspirations. We have to be on offense, talking about what we are going to do.
Amen.
On every one of these issues, and almost especially when you're not in power, is when that obligation is the highest. That's when the American people, you cannot allow them to fall back into this position, which many Americans have, that, well, both sides are equally to blame. No one has any solutions. There's no hope. Offering hope and doing it in not just a rhetorically inspiring way, but doing it in a substantive policy inspiring way is kind of what leadership's all about. And I have to say, which is difficult for me to say coming out of some of these worlds, I'm just not seeing the leadership, because the leadership would start with outreach designed toward unity, right? Meaning we would be a collaborative, unified entity. That doesn't exist. In fact, some of the most vehement competitive and negativity and that you'd see is among these varying organizations that view themselves as competitors. It's very childish. And then you would see a willingness and enthusiasm even for grabbing onto these big issues. I mean, how many times I used to even ask what we were doing. We would go to court through some of these organizations on the most minuscule issues, but what was at stake was the interpretation of the Constitution. And the answer was always, no, the Constitution is so important that we literally have to go and litigate this, even, just for the purposes of symbolism. This is a knife in the heart of the representative democracy, which is the core of our Constitution, of representative government and a government of the people. And, let me just ask you, have you heard one word out of the Republican National Committee or from, its director? Nothing. Anything out of these major right of center organizations that have been the recipients of billions of dollars since the 70s and 80s to defend these principles? Nothing. That to me is a leadership crisis that cannot be ignored. And nor is it one that I individually can solve, but it's one that collectively, with support, we're obligated to solve. Ronna McDaniel's who I'm thinking of. I mean, can you imagine being, by the way, just one anecdote on that, or one footnote on that. Can you imagine being like a federal judge and you're hearing one of these cases related to November 3? You think these guys aren't intelligent enough to be sitting there saying, you're asking me to validate something that literally Ronna McDaniel, head of the RNC, is not validated, right? I mean, you can't tell me that's not a factor, but it's not in the DNA of our side to ever be introspective. I think we need to be introspective and realize that we have lost every major institution of civil society over the last 3 to 4 decades.
Yeah,
And
including
as we did it, all we did was point the finger at the absurdity of it.
yeah, including the traditional like marriage and like our churches, our schools, our education. Like when you say that, man, it really hits home for me because it's not just the surface political stuff. It's deeply entrenched into our traditional way of being, and it's all gone. And it seems to be, I mean, it's not completely gone, but bit by bit, it seems like for lack of a better term, these people that claim to, come from this Marxist leftist angle just been chipping away at it. And now we're sitting here and
strategically too.
Yeah,
that's
for sure.
The key. The key is because you can't look at our side and say we're operating strategically. We're acting reactively in a disjointed way,
right,
and not a unified way. They have had a very elaborate plan that they've executed on, and this is what they're good at. Because at the end of the day, they don't have the people with them. You can ballpark what the percentage of it is, but when you get into some of these real extreme positions that they hold, like say surrendering American leadership in the world, it's got to be 15% or less. And when you really say, hey, this is what these guys intend to do, it's a very small percentage. And we've had a lot of civility on our side. And I find myself sometimes being guilty of that myself, to be intellectually honest about it. I mean, I would like and have always wanted to see a civil nature to our politics. And when you look at the 3 elected officials that I work for, they're kind of right out of a lot of the more moderate side of Republican politics at a time when I strongly believed that representative democracy required degrees of negotiation and compromise. And at the end of the day, what else was there except civil war? I mean, that was kind of to me, the ultimate act of patriotism, is that you acknowledge the diversity that exists in the country. And so when a lot of these social issues emerged, even though you sort of say, well, gee, I don't believe, in those radical ideas, it was always presented like you were being offensive, or you were being intolerant, or just even discriminatory in your viewpoints. And you think about that really plays on the psyche of decency. So somebody like, when even myself going through a lot of those things, I've always wanted to do it in a decent way. I've always wanted to be not perceived to be, or in fact, be engaged in anything that was not inclusive or not tolerant of the other side. And I've never personalized any of these issues. When whole organizations or people, and I've had the most unjust and unfair things done on to me, like anyone in this profession has, I've never personalized it. I've said, that's kind of, the way the other team is going about things. And of course they're going to do that. But I do expect that the people on our side are going to be sufficiently supportive, and that we're going to have a plan. And I think right now, when you look at what the crisis is, it's the leadership crisis.
right.
So who's the leader? We got Trump, and what is the future for Trump? That's a big question. And one thing I would really love to hear from Trump is an acknowledgement, because we all, and me especially, I've been out there in a big way for 5 years, and all the way back to 15, when we announced June 16, 2015, of talking about how important his read on these issues was, how spot on he was. And then the acknowledging, at least the first 3 years pre-pandemic of all of those accomplishments, no doubt, very successful president, but there were some missing components that he needs to address in the next administration. And I think if he addressed, you almost want to hear from him an acknowledgement,
right.
Which I know is not in his instinct.
To say I screwed up and I won't do it again, and moving forward I'm going to do this instead.
Yeah, and honestly, everyone's a product of their background and their experiences, and I'm sure he's seen examples, and he's right. There are examples where people are apologetic or acknowledging flaws, and it only deepens their problems. It doesn't solve them, right? That's the sad reality. And so maybe there's a reluctance to do that. But if we go back to battle again, and he wins, and you certainly can imagine this administration being reelected, or any Democrat out there having any degree of political traction. To all the wind is at our back if we're able to have a free and fair election, and you want someone who's going to acknowledge that we need administration that is staffed with the right people, or we're going to stall out again and get through 4 years and not have major things that we promised accomplished. You need another contract with America, like Gingrich had almost, where we say, here's specifically what we're going to, this is what we promised the American people, This is what we're going to do. This is what we promise you we're not going to do. And then you got to keep your word. The American people really have a lot of respect for that, understandably, that in a field that's not known for following through on promises and being intellectually honest about things, that means a lot to be able to just check off the accomplishments that you promised that you were going to do. These party platforms have come to mean almost nothing in modern times.
Amen. Mr. Johns, thank you. So Michael Johns is the co-founder of the Tea Party movement. He was a White House speechwriter under George H.W. Bush, policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation as well. And I didn't know this, a diehard Eagles fan. Dude, I love that you came out as an Eagles fan. Tell us a little bit about...
I'll go further. I represented Jeff Lurie and the Eagles on the Lincoln Financial Field Stadium deal.
Cool.
When I worked in government relations in the late 90s in Philadelphia. So I had a chance.
And then you were rewarded with a Super Bowl after all those years.
I encouraged John Runyon to run for Congress in New Jersey, where he won.
Wow.
I also told him what it was going to be like when he got down there, and he validated that I was right about that. Wow. So, hey, we made the playoffs, right? I mean, I didn't think halfway through the season that was a possibility. But I have to say,
it was a rebuilding year for sure.
I never would have envisioned the Rams coming out on top this year. I just didn't have that in my. Though I did win my fantasy football league.
What are you doing?
For about the fifth time in 9 years, I think.
Wow. All right. That's not too bad.
Yeah.
Well, man, that's a great story about Runyon. One of my favorite guys, man. That old school bunch of Hugh Douglas and Trottier and Andy Reid was there. The conversations that they had on the bus, and just the madness between, they would never let Reid on that bus, because, the joke was he would eat all the food and stuff like this.
I got a photo with Runyon, and I'm like half his size.
Best, yeah.
And I said, hey, I played defensive end in which I did in high school.
Yeah.
And loved it, but kind of, you want like 6 foot, 6'1" usually for that position. Yeah. Wrestling was my better support, but he says I would have figured you more for a nose guard, which I think in junior high actually was. I played all over the place. It's a great sport. That too, of course, has been highly politicized, and it's turned a lot of fans off. A lot of the biggest NFL fans I know won't turn that game on any longer, which says a lot, because their patriotic sense and commitment is just higher, and they could have gone about that totally differently. Just as a final thought, you could acknowledge that everything that they're saying is true as it relates to getting our arms around law enforcement, making sure that we don't have any racism in society, but you took it out on the flag, man. I mean, that was the wrong object to have taken, because to the extent we fix any of these issues, and many of them I think have been somewhat overblown, it's the flag and everything that it stands for that allows us to resolve it. So you've attacked the very foundation of representative democracy and freedom that allows us to continually improve as a country. And no accident, because we're dealing with, at the core, beneath the layers of battles that they take, some very evil people that do want to see this country fall apart. And we need to come to grips with that in a very concrete way, or they will prevail.
Sam Hanna gets in on Facebook. Trump 2024, first take back the House. November, you will see. No chance in hell this happens with Trump at the helm. Just on the way out, tell me it's all going to be okay. Tell me we take back I mean, I can't even believe I'm saying we, but I so badly want us to get back to law and order, the strong borders.
It's going to be, look, I don't say this as someone, I don't say this because I'm more of an activist than I am an analyst, as much as I think I'm a better analyst than most analysts, these so-called analysts. We're going to take up to 100 seats in 22. This is going to eclipse the Tea Party 2010 revolution, where we picked up over 60, which in turn was the biggest Republican victory since the 1930s. It was historic. And once we do that, I like the idea that, we turn these, because we have so many lingering investigatory issues, that we've got to turn it, these committees have got to be doing the oversight duty and digging into these issues. But I have to say also, I'm frustrated, and I've seen some deficiencies in our system, which is the first time I've ever acknowledged that, is that we shouldn't grind to a halt because one party holds the Congress. I mean, we can't hold committee hearings. We can't bring legislation to the floor. There's way too much power held in the hands of the governing party and too much power in the hands of leadership within both parties. And that renders, you have 535 guys, and men and women down there representing these districts, but in reality, Congress is in the hands of half a dozen people, and they're dealing with lobbyists and money interests, and they're in their positions because they're the best fundraisers in the party, not because they're the best policy visionaries or negotiators or oratory experts or most popular with the people. It's simply fundraising. Money is corrupting the American political system, and yet I acknowledge money as a means of political speech, and the courts have, but we've got to get our arms around making sure that it doesn't take over things, because that's really kind of at the core, in my view, of what's been allowed to happen, and the way foreign countries have been able to infiltrate and influence this country in very irrational and self-damaging ways.
I appreciate your time, brother. I love you. Thank you for the wisdom and the deep knowledge, and for letting me touch you up every year or so and coming on the show. So I really appreciate it.
Great to see you again.
All right, Michael. I appreciate it.
Take care.
All right, take care. Michael John, if you need him. Wow, how about that? That didn't suck. Always such a great wealth of information, and he's dry as hell, but at the end we lightened him up a little bit, talking about the Eagles. Yeah, I forgot he represented Lurie on the stadium, and he told me about counseling Runyon. So thanks. I didn't get to many of the comments tonight, but all the links are in the show description. If you want to find out how to find them, you can find Michael John's here on the Twitter. I had it too zoomed in when we went to the first cut. I'm sorry, that's a bad production job on my part. But here he is on the Twitter. And then these are all the links that are in the show description below. You can find them on Getter here. And maybe I should show you. Oh, you can see the links up there, but you have to zoom it in. You can find them on Parler here. Here he is on the YouTube. And then here he is on the Fake Book. Here he is on the Instagram. Here he is on the Spotify. Spotify? He's got his own Spotify channel. Okay, good. Here he is on the Gab. Here he is on the MeWe. Yeah. Oh, maybe he's got a private. That's weird. Oh, he hasn't posted anything yet. I sent him a Telegram or a MeWe request. And Tucker's on. Oh, shoot. It is 9 o'clock. 8 o'clock your time if you're in the Eastern time zone. Here's Michael Johns. This is his Telegram profile. And then he has a channel as well, so you can find him there. And I mean, talk about a social media monster. This guy, like, just as an example, I tweeted this out yesterday that he's going to be on the show tomorrow, February 28th, 7 p.m. EST. Hashtag JFS live on YouTube, Fakebook, DLive, and Twitch. And, like, get a load of this activity. 126 tweets, retweets. Like, jeepers. The guy has a rabid following. So I appreciate the love. And I appreciate his time. He's well-spoken, deeply knowledgeable, and even with 214,000 followers, like, he didn't always have that many, but his base was always as rabid as, like, just participating in getting the word out there. So anyways, my deep thanks to Michael Johns for coming in. That's the second time I've had him on. He is the co-founder of the Tea Party movement. He was in the White House of George Bush Sr., HW, and he is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And as we mentioned, a diehard Eagles fan. And I used to have that in my bio, and he just dropped by the other day to say, Jim, I had no idea you were an Eagles fan. I go, oh, yeah. Yep. It's the only football team I've ever been a fan of. So deep thanks to Michael Johns and everyone else that tuned in tonight. Thank you very much. Peace, love, hug your neighbor, and whatever you do, don't put me full screen like that. Whatever you do, rip that mask off your face. It's not working. I love you. I'm out.